Okay, good afternoon or morning, ladies and gentlemen. Well, it should be afternoon most likely because most of you have taken the quiz at this point. I hope you're happy with your grade, but now we are going to move on to our lesson, our period 2 lesson today, which is our first lesson in terms of the lead up to the Civil War. So the focus question is, and you just pause this if you need, but the focus question is, how did sectionalism begin to divide the country? And sectionalism is a term that we briefly looked at when we looked at the Washington's farewell address. We're going to really go over it again now so we understand how this kind of mentality led to the Civil War coming up here. All right, so you guys can just pause the video if you need to continue copying, but I'm going to just move on. And then the first thing we need to do is also just quickly review. There's nothing you need to write down yet. We need to just quickly review the difference between a state and a territory. All right. So if you guys take a look, okay, the first thing that you're going to notice is we've seen this before, but just to remind you of a couple things. We have states and we have territories that come within our country. A lot of territories are going to become states between the periods of 1820 to 1870, over 10. And since this process is going to take place a lot, the next thing we kind of need to decide and understand is back in history, all right, one of the big things is territories could not have slaves. States had a choice. You could either be a slave state or you could be a free state. So we're going to kind of talk about the differences between the two, but you're going to see some states, you're going to see some territories, and we're going to kind of talk about the differences as we go on a little bit. So I just wanted to kind of bring this as a reminder to you guys. All right. So give me 1 second. I just need to open up something. One second. Okay, perfect. Okay. So this is kind of what you notice here. Okay, so use the map to kind of help you. What do you notice about the location of the slave states from the free states? Okay, so a slave state was a state where their state constitution basically said that they were allowed to have slavery and it was legal. If you did not allow slavery, you were what's known as a free state. So every state got to decide if they wanted to be a free state or a slave state. Now, why isn't this something that has come up, okay, within our country? And why don't we just make a decision to say, okay, we're going to either have slavery as a country or we're not going to have slavery? Well, that all goes back to the Constitution and the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment said if nothing's written in the Constitution about slavery or about anything, it becomes a state decision. So the states here had decisions on if they wanted to be a free or a slave state. And what you'll notice is the free states are pretty much located here in the north. The slave states are located here in the south. All right. And that is directly related to because of the farmland and the fact that the slaves needed to work on the farmland to kind of get them acclimated to society. All right. So just very basic stuff here. All right. Take a look at this map coming up here. All right. We're going to break down our country into 3 sections for this unit. We're going to have the north, which consists of pretty much all states. The south, which consists of pretty much all states. And then you have the west, which will consist of some states and some territories. Okay? A lot of the problems and a lot of the controversies happen out in the west because at this point, we have a lot of territories becoming states, and that whole notion is going to bring a divide with our country because of the amount of territories that are going to become either slave states or going to become either free states. Okay, so here's the one thing that you do need to copy down. It's going to take you some time. I'll take my time to go through it. Okay, after you wrote down the focus question, you're going to make yourself a chart, a 3-level chart like this. All right, so at any point you need to pause the video to write this down, but let's just first start with the definition. Let's first start with the definition of sectionalism. Okay? So sectionalism is where you as an individual in your state or your state, you place the interests of your city and your region ahead of the country. All right? So what does that mean? Okay. When you place how do I put this? We're the United States of America. We are an entire country, but we have a lot of different areas. Okay. The main end goal for our country and our people in our country to do its best to help out our area of the country. Okay. We want to help out our country first. We don't necessarily want to focus in on doing what's best for our area at certain times. So there's certain times where you want to do what's best for the Bronx, or you want to do what's best for New York. Okay. And the coronavirus situation might be one of those situations. If things are getting really bad, then it may be best to shut down a particular city or state, as opposed to shutting down the entire country. Maybe there's no reason to shut down North Dakota, no reason to shut down Kansas because they don't have as many cases. All right. So sometimes on a state-by-state basis, it's not a bad thing. All right. But sectionalism goes a step beyond that. Okay. Sectionalism is not being able to understand why a particular person from another area thinks the way they do. The most modern example could be, why did Georgia, who always votes for Republicans, now votes for Trump? Votes for Biden instead of Trump. Why does Florida decide to vote for Trump? What's wrong with them, sort of thing. That's the bad mentality we got to get out of as a country. All right. People are going to have differing opinions. People are going to have different ideas. People are going to think differently. So you need to be understanding and maybe not as much, accepting, but you need to be able to see other people's points of view, whether you disagree with it or not. Back in American history, we can never really do that. The North can never see the South's point of view. The South can never see the North's point of view. The West can never see the North's point of view. Everyone just had their own way of life, and then everyone just kind of followed along that. We weren't very united in terms of that. So while Manifest Destiny is going on, while our country is growing, at the same time of us growing, we're also dividing. So we're going to look at the three sections of the United States at this time and really break down what is important to each section, and you'll just see how different everyone is. All right. So if you lived in the North, or you were a state in the North had what's called an industrial economy. All right, and this is a perfect time for me to start to say that your secret coded word is going to be today economy. I feel like that's a pretty random word, but your secret coded word is going to be economy today. So you guys can write that down in your notes. All right, but we're moving on. All right. So the industrial economy, which we talked about briefly last Thursday, we talked about how the North had a focus on machines, factories, okay, hiring workers, hiring women to work in those factories, as opposed to working on farmland. Now, it doesn't mean they didn't have any farms in the North, but their major focus was working through the factories. They had lots of factories, they had lots of railroads, they had lots of manufacturing. Okay, the textile industry, the clothing industry was the biggest factory that they had going, and they made a lot of money off of it, right? Making fabric, making clothes, the power loom, even cotton, okay, which was produced in the South, was brought up to the North. It was a huge help. In the North, slavery was not needed, therefore it was illegal. All right, the North did not have many slaves or any slaves at all, and it was illegal if you were caught to have one in the North. Okay, what you're not writing down, though, is very important. The North had many immigrants coming into the country. We'll learn about this more in future units. So they had a more diverse population, okay, that wasn't as focused in on, the Southern, their way of life, because they're coming from different areas. The North generally believed more in federal power. They believed that our federal government should have more control on issues. So a lot of people in the North thought the federal government should decide to ban slavery as a whole. Okay, and they believe the federal government should have more power, and of course we know they have a colder climate. The South in the 1800s had almost completely differing viewpoints and way of life. They had an agricultural economy. There was a major emphasis on farming and a major emphasis on growing cotton. Okay, now I'm going to challenge you for the first time to understand the Southern perspective, even though many of us will disagree with it. When I was your age, I used to look at the Southerners as these deeply racist people who just hated black people and wanted to do the worst things to them and keep them as slaves. Try and think beyond that. It wasn't necessarily that they were bad people in their minds. They simply didn't look at slaves as an equal person. Okay, and we'll talk about this a lot over time, and I'll give you some examples. But the biggest thing I want you to understand is, if you took away the slaves from the Southern economy, you would crush their economy. Their economy would be very weak. Many people would become poor. So it's not necessarily at times, even though it's easy to look at, oh yeah, the people in the South were racist because they had slaves and, you know, screw them sort of thing. We need to understand that they knew that since their country and their area was so reliant on slaves, that, you know what? They needed those slaves for their economy to succeed. So it wasn't just them not seeing African Americans as equal people, and that is a problem, don't get me wrong. It was the fact that if you lost the slaves, you lost their economy, you lost their money. All right, so the South was very much in favor of slavery, keeping it legal, because it was so important to their way of life in the South, because they needed their economy to succeed. Now, I think I mentioned when the cotton gin was created, the South was kind of getting slavery. We were kind of getting rid of slavery until the cotton gin came out. Then the South realized how profitable cotton was and how helpful the cotton gin was, and they kept slavery. And in fact, slavery got stronger, okay, where we needed more slaves in the South, and it just became a huge mess. But if the cotton gin was never created, there's probably no slavery after 1800. And that's the truth. All right? It wasn't just the South and slavery. It also had to do with states' rights and the 10th Amendment. A lot of the Southerners were descendants from Thomas Jefferson's thinking, you know, the fact of the, the people in the South, okay, should rely on the 10th Amendment. They should rely on states' rights. They didn't want the federal government to become too powerful. All right, they were very much like the Revolutionary War thinkers in that aspect. All right, so they believed in what we call states' rights. They wanted to make sure the federal government didn't get too much power, and they believed that if you basically got rid of slavery, that would also mean the federal government would get stronger because they're putting their foot down, and they were worried that the federal government would become too powerful. So it's still kind of that same worry we had back during the Revolutionary War. Okay? The West as well was an agricultural economy. Therefore, many Southerners decided to move west into the western area, okay, right over here. And as we know, this is where the Great Plains and Louisiana Purchase was. We know there's a lot of farmland there as well. Okay, and obviously, a lot of Southerners want to bring their slaves out there. But it becomes a huge issue, okay, as time goes on, because slavery is allowed in certain areas in the West, but not all areas. And this is going to cause a problem because now you're going to have some Northerners and Southerners moving out west, getting into some clashes over slavery. All right, they did have an emphasis on farming, but they also were miners, so they worked underground, okay, working with minerals, okay, and they were big into buffalo hunting, though we will talk about that more when we get to Unit 3. All right, and probably one of the most underrated things in the West, as you'll learn, is railroads were really important because you had so much land, you need the railroads to travel across as opposed to the northern and southern cities. All right, so you have your secret coded word at this point, okay? You have this box down and filled out at this point. Hopefully at this point, you could just end the video here. You could post your notes to the assignment, and you are going to be done for the day besides this one last reading that we're going to do. Okay, so let me pull this up here. All right, here we go. So let's read through this together. Two Americas emerge. All right, understanding sectionalism. So in the first half of the 19th century, the United States and its people found themselves going in two very different directions. That division generally reflected the geographic differences between the North and the South. As a result of their different geographies, those two regions had developed very different economic, social, and cultural features. The North had rocky terrain and a short growing season produced a trade-based economy in the North. This is something we're familiar with. Shipping became a key industry in the mid-1800s, while Northern merchants bought and sold raw products from the South and the West. So this is an example with cotton. South would be sold from the north, from the South into the North, and they would use that to manufacture T-shirts, clothing, things along those lines. In addition, manufacturing grew in the North as mass production methods spread. We'll talk about mass production later. Improving transportation and communication helped industry by allowing factories to obtain materials and send their products over greater and greater distances. All right. Northern political opinions often favored the Whig Party's view. Okay, so we have our second secret coded word, which is going to be the Whig Party. So the first one we've already mentioned earlier, the Whig Party is going to be the second one. Okay, that is your second coded word. So you have both your coded words now for today. The Whig Party's view of federal supremacy and leadership of the nation's economy. Northern Protestants believed that communities should set moral standards, and they supported government intervention in economic and even social issues. Many wanted, for example, to allow states to outlaw alcohol and enforce Sabbath observation, which is like, going to church on Sunday. Northern Protestants also extolled the virtues of hard work and education, both of which supported urban and industrial culture. So what I would say is this. Okay, this is all trying to get the federal government to have more power and more control because they want the federal government to make more laws that everyone in the country has to follow. The South, on the other hand, with its warm climate and fertile soil, the South welcomed agriculture. Settlers grew tobacco, rice, sugarcane, and cotton. By the 1800s, the plantation system, dependent on the unpaid labor of enslaved Africans, firmly supported this expanding agricultural economy. So do we be industrial? Do we be agricultural? Depending on where you are, change your viewpoint. Plantations dominated the South, which therefore developed little industry. Not saying they had no industry, no factories, but just very little. Most Southern trade involved the export of raw materials, largely to Northern and British textile factories, in exchange for manufactured goods. Southern political opinions grew out of the region's cultural lifestyle. Based on a rural or farm aristocracy, with wealthy planters holding nearly all the influence, the Southern culture favored an easygoing, gracious way of life that rested on tradition. People frowned on an overly eager effort to accumulate wealth and viewed Northern bankers as corrupt. They also opposed the idea that government or anyone else should dictate morality or regulate banking and trade. So again, the South, with their states' rights and their viewpoint, they don't want to have government getting stronger. They don't want to have government talking about banking and trade. Okay, that's something that should be left up to the states. Southerners cherished their history and faced the nation's rapid modernization and industrialization with suspicion. So now let's go into the slavery aspect. Sectionalism grew increasingly pronounced during the first half of the 19th century as slavery arose as a hot-button issue. Hoping to gain access to fresh lands, Southerners also pushed for the expansion of slavery into the new territories and states, such as Texas. Northerners increasingly disapproved of the slavery on moral grounds and disliked the South's headstrong attitude toward the federal government. They worked against expansion of slavery into the new territories. So we'll talk about stopping the spread of slavery as opposed to stopping slavery. But for now, we're going to look at how the North wanted to stop the spread of slavery. They didn't want it to go into the West, where slavery wasn't really around. Okay, and then many did not want Texas to be annexed, which we've talked about how Texas wanted to become a part of our country, but they had slavery, so it was controversial. Those issues grew worse as the nation moved toward war, which we will get to soon. So at this point, we've done the reading. Okay, we've done our notes. Please post the notes. Please post the 2 secret coded words. And have a great rest of your day. I will see you guys tomorrow.